I never expected a simple smile from my friend's mom to unravel into the most intense moment of my life. One I still can't forget. It was one of those afternoons where the air seemed to hang heavy with summer warmth, lazy and unhurried. I had come over to spend time with my friend, but he had stepped out for a quick errand, leaving me alone in the house. The silence was broken only by the hum of the ceiling fan and the faint clinking of dishes from the kitchen. That's where I saw her. She moved with a kind of ease that caught my attention immediately, not in an obvious way, but in the natural rhythm of someone who doesn't need to announce her presence to be noticed. The light from the window framed her as she reached up to place a glass on the shelf, her bracelets sliding softly down her wrist with the motion. I found myself watching longer than I meant to, almost startled by how the simplest gestures carried a quiet elegance. When she turned and saw me leaning in the doorway, she smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile you give out of politeness. It was warm, familiar, with just enough softness to make me feel unexpectedly seen. She brushed a strand of hair back from her face, tucking it behind her ear, and in that small moment, something shifted. Her eyes lingered on mine a little longer than I expected, as though she was letting me in on something unspoken. I laughed lightly, pretending to comment on the heat of the day, but inside, I was trying to steady myself. It wasn't that I hadn't noticed her before. I always knew she carried herself differently from other women I met. But now, standing there, the distance between us felt smaller. The scent of citrus and something faintly floral drifted toward me, subtle and familiar, and I realized it was her. She asked me if I wanted a drink, her tone casual, as if the offer were nothing at all. But when she handed me the glass, her fingers brushed against mine for the briefest moment. The touch was accidental, or at least it should have been, but the warmth of it lingered in a way I couldn't ignore. We exchanged a few words, about my studies, about how quickly the summer seemed to be passing, but the conversation wasn't what stayed with me. It was the way she listened, tilting her head slightly, eyes steady and attentive, as if I was worth more of her focus than I deserved. I caught myself wondering if I was imagining it, the extra beat her gaze held, the way her laugh carried a note of ease that felt reserved for me. Maybe it was just the heat, maybe it was nothing more than the comfort of a familiar home. Yet, as she brushed her hair back again, her smile returning almost playfully, I felt the air between us change. It was the first spark. Quiet, fleeting, but enough to leave me unsettled, curious, and more aware of her than I had ever been before. Later that afternoon, the house settled into an easy kind of quiet. My friend still hadn't returned, and I found myself in the living room, absently scrolling on my phone, pretending not to notice how empty the space felt without him. The cushion sank a little beside me as I leaned back, the air carrying that faint mixture of polished wood and something floral, the scent I now realized belonged to her. She walked in, holding a cup of tea, and for a moment I thought she might pass through. Instead, she paused, tilted her head, and smiled softly before sitting down across from me. The light from the window traced a glow along her cheekbones, highlighting the natural grace in her expression. "What's keeping you busy these days?" she asked, her voice gentle but curious, as if she genuinely wanted to know. I set my phone aside, caught off guard by her interest. We slipped into conversation easily, classes, late nights of studying, how I wasn't sure where I was heading next. She listened in a way few people did, leaning forward slightly, her hand resting loosely against her chin. It wasn't just the words that mattered, but the way her eyes didn't wander, the way she seemed to hold on to everything I said. At one point, she laughed at something I admitted about losing track of time during exams, and the sound filled the room, light but lingering. She reached out without thinking, her fingertips brushing lightly against my arm, as if to steady her amusement. The touch was brief, casual enough to dismiss, but I felt it long after. My skin tingled where her fingers had been, and I wondered if she noticed the way my breath faltered. Her knee shifted slightly closer as she settled deeper into the couch, and I couldn't ignore the warmth of her presence. It was the kind of closeness you tell yourself doesn't mean anything, but the awareness of it is impossible to push aside. The space between us seemed smaller than it should have been. We kept talking, about travel she once dreamed of taking, about how much had changed since her own college days. I listened more than I spoke, half because I didn't want to interrupt, half because her voice held a calm steadiness I didn't want to lose. Now and then she brushed her hair back from her face, a small, unconscious gesture, but each time it revealed more of her, the curve of her neck, the faint trace of a smile tugging at her lips. And every time her eyes met mine, I felt the question rise, was this all in my head, or was there something unspoken passing quietly between us? The longer we sat there, the more I noticed how the silence after each laugh stretched just a little too long, how my heart picked up in those pauses. She didn't seem to mind them either. If anything, she seemed comfortable in the stillness. By the time my friend's footsteps echoed faintly from outside, I realized I had been holding my breath, not because of what had happened, but because of what almost had. Evening had begun to settle in, the sunlight fading into softer shades that stretched across the walls. The living room felt different now, quieter, heavier, as if the stillness itself had drawn us closer together. My friend still hadn't returned, and though a part of me expected her to excuse herself, she didn't. Instead, she lingered, curling one leg beneath her as she leaned into the couch, cradling her tea in both hands. Our conversation shifted from light, easy topics to something more personal. She asked me about my family, about whether I felt pressure to figure out everything so soon in life. I answered honestly, admitting the uncertainty I often carried, and she nodded with an understanding that felt almost too precise, as if she'd lived through it herself. Then, almost without warning, she sighed, not dramatically, but in a way that felt like a weight being released. Her gaze dropped to the rim of her cup, her voice softening as she said, "You know, sometimes I wonder if people ever really see me. Or if they just see the version of me they expect." The words hung in the air, delicate but heavy. I shifted, unsure how to respond, but her honesty pulled me in. She brushed a strand of hair back behind her ear, her eyes flicking to mine briefly, searching. For a moment, she looked less like the confident woman who seemed to glide through every room and more like someone quietly admitting a truth she rarely shared. "I don't mean to sound ungrateful," she continued, her tone careful, almost apologetic. "I have a good life. I do. But sometimes, even surrounded by people, I feel invisible." I felt my chest tighten, not with pity, but with recognition. I knew what it was like to feel overlooked, to wonder if anyone truly noticed the small things that made you who you were. And here she was, someone who, from the outside, seemed so composed, so self-assured, revealing the opposite. I set my glass down and leaned forward slightly, not too much, just enough to show I was listening. "I notice," I said quietly, the words slipping out before I could second-guess them. Her eyes lifted to mine, and in them was something I couldn't name at first, relief, maybe, or gratitude. For a few long seconds neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was intimate, almost fragile, as if speaking too loudly might break it. She smiled then, a small, almost tentative smile, and I felt the warmth of it settle in me. She didn't reach for my hand, but the way she looked at me felt like its own kind of touch, gentle, steady, and deeply real. The room dimmed as the sun slipped further away, shadows stretching long across the floor. And though nothing more was said, I knew something had shifted between us. She had trusted me with a part of herself she didn't often show, and I carried the weight of it carefully, like a secret I wanted to protect. It wasn't the kind of moment you could explain to anyone else. But sitting there, with her eyes lingering on mine and the world beyond the walls fading into night, I knew it was the beginning of something I couldn't ignore. By the time the evening had fully settled, the house felt like it belonged only to us. The silence had a weight to it, but not the uncomfortable kind, more like a soft blanket wrapping itself around the edges of our closeness. The dim light from a single lamp in the corner gave the room a quiet glow, turning the space intimate in a way I hadn't noticed before. She returned from the kitchen with 2 glasses, condensation sliding slowly down the sides. Her movements were slower now, less hurried, as if she, too, had surrendered to the stillness of the night. When she handed me a glass, her fingers brushed against mine, the contact lingering just a fraction longer than it needed to. My chest tightened, heat rising beneath my skin, and I wondered if she could feel the way my pulse quickened. She sat beside me this time, not across the room. The cushion dipped under her weight, and suddenly I was aware of how close she was, of the faint warmth radiating from her body. The quiet clink of ice in her glass filled the silence as she swirled it absent-mindedly, then set it down on the table with a soft sigh. For a moment neither of us spoke. I tried to focus on the drink in my hand, but my eyes kept drifting toward her. The curve of her jaw caught in the lamplight, the way her hair fell loosely over her shoulder. And then, she brushed it back, tucking it behind her ear, revealing her face fully to me. Her gaze found mine, steady, almost playful, but softened by something deeper I couldn't quite name. "You're making me hot," she said quietly, her lips curling into the faintest smile. The words struck harder than I expected, playful on the surface, but carrying an undercurrent I couldn't dismiss. My breath caught, and for a heartbeat, I didn't know how to respond. She leaned back slightly, still holding my gaze, as if waiting to see what I would do with the moment. I laughed lightly, nervous, trying to deflect. "It's warm in here," I offered, though the excuse sounded weak even to me. She didn't argue. Instead, she tilted her head, her smile deepening just a little, as though she knew the effect she was having. The air between us thickened, charged with a tension that felt both dangerous and irresistible. My skin buzzed with awareness of every inch between us, how little space there really was, how easy it would be to close it. I felt the pull, undeniable and strong, but beneath it ran hesitation, the reality of who she was, who I was, the line I wasn't sure I should cross. Still, her nearness was overwhelming. The scent of her perfume, light, citrus with a faint floral edge, filled my senses. Her shoulder brushed mine as she shifted, casual enough to pass as accident, but deliberate enough to make my heart race. She didn't press forward, didn't say anything more. She just let the words she'd spoken linger, heavy and unshakable, as if they had already changed everything. And in the quiet hum of the moment, I realized they had. The silence after her words stretched long, filling the room with a pulse I could almost hear. My heart was racing, not only from what she had said but from everything it carried with it. "You're making me hot." I replayed it in my mind, each syllable sharper than the last, and it left me caught between wanting to move closer and fearing what it would mean if I did. She didn't push me. She simply sat there, her body angled slightly toward mine, one arm resting along the back of the couch, her glass untouched on the table. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between amused and vulnerable, as though she knew she had given me something heavy to hold and was waiting to see what I'd do with it. I shifted, my hands tightening around my glass, my voice catching before I could even form words. Everything in me wanted to lean into the pull I felt, to see if the electricity sparking between us would ignite into something more. But then the reality of it all pressed hard against me. She wasn't just a beautiful woman who had shared her loneliness and warmth with me tonight. She was my friend's mom. The thought cut through the haze, and I leaned back slightly, creating just enough distance to breathe. She noticed. Her eyes softened, and instead of disappointment, there was something gentler there, understanding. Almost as if she could feel the war happening inside me. "You don't have to say anything," she murmured, her voice low and steady. Then, slowly, she placed her hand over mine. Not forcefully, not with urgency, just a quiet, reassuring touch. Her palm was warm, her fingers curling softly around my knuckles, grounding me in a moment that felt dangerously unsteady. The touch was enough to calm me, but it also deepened the conflict. My skin tingled under her hand, and I had to fight the urge to hold on to her in return. She squeezed lightly, then let go, her hand retreating to her lap, leaving behind both relief and a hollow ache. I turned to look at her, and she gave me a small smile, not playful this time, but tender. A smile that told me she understood the hesitation, that she wasn't angry, that maybe she had expected it. Inside, though, the storm raged. I wanted to ask why me, why now? I wanted to know if the spark I felt was real for her too, or if I was simply filling a quiet space in her life. But the words stuck, caught somewhere between caution and longing. The room felt heavier now, charged not with the anticipation of what might happen, but with the unspoken acknowledgement of what almost had. And in that stillness, I realized something. Restraint didn't make the moment weaker. If anything, it made it stronger. The choice not to act, not to cross that fragile line, filled the air with an intimacy deeper than touch. When her hand slipped back into her lap, I felt its absence as sharply as if something had been taken from me. And yet, at the same time, I knew the space between us was the only thing holding me together. The storm inside me hadn't fully quieted, but something about the way she smiled, soft, almost grateful, let me breathe again. The tension that had filled the room just moments before didn't vanish, but it reshaped itself into something gentler, something I could stay with. She leaned back against the couch, her shoulders loosening, as if she, too, had decided that words and closeness could mean more than giving in to impulse. "I don't usually talk this much," she admitted after a pause, her voice lighter now, though it carried a trace of shyness. "But you make it easy." Her honesty made me smile, and before I knew it, I was laughing quietly with her. The laughter wasn't loud or forced, it was easy, comfortable, and it smoothed out the sharp edges of the moment we had just shared. For a few seconds, it felt like the world outside had completely disappeared. Without thinking too much about it, I shifted slightly closer, letting the cushions press us together just enough to notice. She didn't move away. Instead, she exhaled softly, as if relieved that I hadn't completely pulled back. Her head tilted, resting lightly against my shoulder. The weight was delicate but certain, and in that simple gesture, everything slowed. I felt the warmth of her through the thin fabric of my shirt, the faint tickle of her hair brushing against my jawline. My breath steadied, my heart still racing but in a different rhythm now, not from urgency, but from a kind of quiet awe. I didn't move, didn't speak. I just let her stay there, and in that silence, I realized how much meaning could live in the smallest things. The nearness of her, the trust in the way she allowed her body to rest against mine, said more than any daring words ever could. She sighed again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was content, almost peaceful. "It feels nice, not having to explain everything," she said softly, her voice so close I felt the vibrations through her cheek against my shoulder. I wanted to tell her that she didn't need to explain anything to me, that I had already heard more in her silences and glances than in any confession she could have made. But instead, I simply let my arm shift along the back of the couch until it brushed gently against her shoulder. I didn't wrap it around her, didn't pull her in, but the contact was enough. A quiet promise of presence, of safety. The room around us seemed to dissolve into the dim light, the ticking of the clock, the faint hum of the night outside. We didn't need more. This closeness, her head against me, my steady breathing, the shared silence, was its own kind of intimacy. Not rushed, not forbidden. Just real. For the first time all evening, the intensity faded into calm, and I realized that maybe what we both needed wasn't something reckless, but something steady. Something that let us feel seen, without crossing a line that could break everything. And as she stayed there, eyes closed, trusting the moment, I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the heat of the room and everything to do with her. The night had grown deeper by the time either of us moved. The house was quiet, cloaked in shadows and lamplight, as if it had been holding its breath right along with us. She stirred gently against me, lifting her head from my shoulder, and for a moment I missed the warmth of her there. Her eyes met mine, calm now, softened by the hours we had shared. "It's late," she said softly, her voice carrying both reluctance and practicality. She rose from the couch, smoothing her hair back in that familiar gesture that had stirred so much in me earlier. I followed her lead, standing slowly, feeling the heaviness of the moment pressing against my chest. She walked me toward the door, the silence between us thick but not uncomfortable. If anything, it was charged with everything unspoken, all the glances, the touches, the pauses that had carried more meaning than words ever could. At the doorway, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the frame, her body angled toward me in a way that told me she wasn't ready to let me go just yet. For a few long seconds, we just stood there. I could hear the faint chorus of crickets outside, the distant hum of the night settling over the neighborhood. But all I could focus on was her, the way the porch light spilled across her features, softening the lines of her face, catching in her eyes like tiny sparks. "Thank you," she whispered finally, her voice so quiet it almost blended into the night. "For listening. For being here." The words struck me harder than I expected. I wanted to tell her that she didn't need to thank me, that I should be the one thanking her for letting me see a part of her no one else seemed to. But my voice caught, and instead I simply nodded, hoping my expression said what I couldn't. She stepped closer then, just enough that I could feel the faint brush of her breath against my cheek. Her hand lifted, hesitating for a heartbeat before settling lightly against my arm. And then, with a softness that unraveled me completely, she leaned in and pressed her lips to my cheek. It wasn't long, it wasn't lingering, but it was full of meaning. Gentle, deliberate, a kiss that carried gratitude and tenderness, leaving behind the faintest warmth on my skin. When she pulled back, her eyes lingered on mine, holding me in that quiet spell for just a moment longer. Neither of us said anything else. There was no need. The night had already spoken for us. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool air brushing against my face, grounding me again. I turned once before leaving, and she was still there, framed in the doorway, her hair catching the porch light, her smile faint but steady. I walked away carrying more than just the memory of her touch. I carried the weight of everything unspoken, everything quietly understood, the spark, the restraint, the warmth we had chosen over impulse. And though the night had ended, I knew it would stay with me, etched in a way I wouldn't easily forget.